Good morning, friends. The period for being summoned to interrogation passed, and for those left in the cell, a long, pleasant day stretched ahead, lightened by opportunities and not overly darkened by duties. Duties could include sterilizing the cots with a blowtorch twice a month. At the Lubyanka, matches were categorically forbidden to prisoners. To get a light for a cigarette, we had to signal patiently with a finger when the peephole was opened, thus asking the jailer for a light. But blowtorches were entrusted to us without hesitation, and once a week we might be called into the corridor to have our faces clipped with a dull clipper, allegedly a right, but strongly resembling a duty. And one might be assigned to the duty of cleaning the parquet floor in the cell. Z always avoided this work because it was beneath his dignity, like any other work, in fact. We got out of breath quickly because we were underfed. Otherwise, we would have considered this duty a privilege. It was such gay, lively work, pushing the brush forward with one's bare foot, torso pulled back, and then turned about, forward, back, and forget all your grief, shiny as a mirror, a Potemkin prison. Besides, we didn't have to go on being overcrowded in our old cell 67 any longer. In the middle of March, we added a 6th prisoner to our number, and since here in the Lubyanka they did not fill all the cells with board bunks, nor make you sleep on the floor, they transferred all of us into a beauty of a cell, number 53. I would advise anyone who has not yet been in it to pay it a visit. This was not a cell. It was a palace chamber set aside as a sleeping apartment for distinguished travelers. The Yesaya Insurance Company, without a thought for economy, had raised the height of the ceiling in this wing to 16.5 feet. Oh, what 4-story bunks the chief of counterintelligence at the front would have slapped in here, and he could have gotten 100 people in. Results guaranteed. And the window, it was such an enormous window that standing on its sill, the jailer could hardly reach the portochka, that hinged ventilation pane. One section of this window alone would have made a fine whole window in an ordinary house. Only the riveted steel sheets of the muzzle, closing off 4/5 of it, reminded us that we were not in a palace after all. Nonetheless, on clear days above this muzzle, from the wall of the Lubyanka courtyard, from some window pane or other on the 6th or 7th floor, we now and then got a pale reflection of a ray of sunlight. To us it was a real ray of sunlight, a living, dear being. We followed with affection its climb up the wall, and every step it made was filled with meaning, presaging the time of our daily outing in the fresh air, counting off several half-hours before lunch. Then, just before lunch, it disappeared, and our rites included being let out for a walk, reading books, telling one another about the past, listening and learning, arguing and being educated. And we would be rewarded by a lunch that included 2 courses, too good to be true. The walk was bad on the first 3 floors of the Lubyanka. The prisoners were let out into a damp, low-lying little courtyard in the bottom of a narrow well between prison buildings. But the prisoners on the 4th and 5th floors, on the other hand, were taken to an eagle's perch on the roof of the 5th floor. It had a concrete floor. There were concrete walls 3 times the height of a man. We were accompanied by an unarmed jailer. On the watchtower was a sentinel with an automatic weapon. But the air was real and the sky was real. Hands behind your back. Line up in pairs. No talking. No stopping. Such were the commands, but they forgot to forbid us to throw back our heads. And of course we did just that. Here one could see not a reflected, not a second-hand sun, but the real one, the real eternally living sun itself, or its golden diffusion through the spring clouds. Spring promises everyone happiness, and tenfold to the prisoner. Oh, April sky, it didn't matter that I was in prison. Evidently they were not going to shoot me, and in the end I would become wiser here. I would come to understand many things here. Heaven. I would correct my mistakes yet. Oh, heaven, not for them, but for you, heaven. I'd come to understand those mistakes here, and I would correct them. As if from a pit, from the far-off lower reaches, from Dzerzhinsky Square, the hoarse, earthly singing of the automobile horns rose to us in a constant refrain. To those who were dashing along to the tune of those honkings, they seemed the trumpets of creation, but from here their insignificance was very clear. The walk in the fresh air lasted only 20 minutes, but how much there was about it to concern oneself with, how much one had to accomplish while it lasted. In the first place, it was very interesting to try to figure out the layout of the entire prison while they were taking you there and back, and to calculate where those tiny hanging courtyards were, so that at some later date, out in freedom, one could walk along the square and spot their location. We made many turns on the way there, and I invented the following system. Starting from the cell itself, I would count every turn to the right as +1, and every turn to the left as -1. And no matter how quickly they made us turn, the idea was not to try to picture it hastily to oneself, but to count up the total. If, in addition, through some staircase window, you could catch a glimpse of the backs of the Lubyanka water nymphs, half reclining against the pillared turret, which hovered over the square itself, and you could remember the exact point in your count when this happened, then, back in the cell, you could orient yourself and figure out what your own window looked out on. And during the outdoor walk, you concentrated on breathing as much fresh air as possible. There, too, alone, beneath that bright heaven, you had to imagine your bright future life, sinless and without error. There, too, was the best place of all to talk about the most dangerous subjects. It didn't matter that conversation during the walk was forbidden. One simply had to know how to manage it. The compensation was that in all likelihood you could not be overheard either by a stoolie or by a microphone. During these walks, I tried to get into a pair with Susie. We talked together in the cell, but we liked to try talking about the main things here. We hadn't come together quickly. It took some time. But he had already managed to tell me a great deal. I acquired a new capability from him, to accept patiently and purposefully things that had never had any place in my own plans and had, it seemed, no connection at all with the clearly outlined direction of my life. From childhood on, I had somehow known that my objective was the history of the Russian Revolution, and that nothing else concerned me. To understand the Revolution, I had long since required nothing beyond Marxism. I cut myself off from everything else that came up and turned my back on it. And now fate brought me together with Susie. He breathed a completely different sort of air, and he would tell me passionately about his own interests, and these were Estonia and democracy. And although I never expected to become interested in Estonia, much less bourgeois democracy, I nevertheless kept listening and listening to his loving stories of 20 free years in that modest, work-loving small nation of big men whose ways were slow and set. I listened to the principles of the Estonian constitution, which had been borrowed from the best of European experience, and to how their 100-member one-house parliament had worked. And though the why of it wasn't clear, I began to like it all, and store it all away in my experience. I listened willingly to their fatal history. The tiny Estonian anvil had from way, way back been caught between two hammers. The Teutons and the Slavs. Blows showered on it from east and west in turn, and there was no end to it, and there still isn't. And there was the well-known, totally unknown, story of how we Russians wanted to take them over in one fell swoop in 1918, but they refused to yield, and how later on Yudenik spoke contemptuously of their Finnish heritage, and we ourselves christened them White Guard bandits. Then the Estonian gymnasium students enrolled as volunteers. We struck Estonia again in 1940, and again in 41, and again in 44. Some of their sons were conscripted by the Russian army, and others by the German army, and still others ran off into the woods. The elderly Tallinn intellectuals discussed how they might break out of that iron ring, break away somehow, and live for themselves and by themselves. Their premier might possibly have been Tief, and their minister of education, say Susie, but neither Churchill nor Roosevelt cared about them in the least. But Uncle Joe did, and during the very first nights after the Soviet armies entered Tallinn, all these dreamers were seized in their Tallinn apartments. 15 of them were imprisoned in various cells of the Moscow Lubyanka, one in each, and were charged under Article 58-2 with the criminal desire for national self-determination. Each time we returned to the cell from our walk was like being arrested again. Again, in our very special cell, the air seemed stifling after the outdoors, and it would have been good to have a snack afterward, too, but it was best not to think about it, not at all. It was bad if one of the prisoners who received food parcels tactlessly spread out his treasures at the wrong time and began to eat. All right, we'll develop self-control. It was bad, too, to be betrayed by the author of the book you were reading. If you began to drool over food in the greatest detail, get away from me, Gogol. Get away from me, Chekhov, too. They both had too much food in their books. He didn't really feel like eating, but nonetheless he ate a helping of veal and drank some beer. The son of a bitch. It was better to read... It was better to read spiritual things. Dostoevsky was the right kind of author for prisoners to read. Yet even in Dostoevsky you could find that passage, "The children went hungry. For several days they had seen nothing but bread and sausage." The Lubyanka library was the prison's principal ornament. True, the librarian was repulsive, a blonde spinster with a horsey build, who did everything possible to make herself ugly. Her face was so whitened that it looked like a doll's immobile mask, and her lips were purple, and her plucked eyebrows were black. You might say that was her own business, but we would have enjoyed it more if she had been a charmer. However, perhaps the chief of the Lubyanka had already taken that into consideration. And here was a wonder. Once every 10 days, when she came to take away our books, she listened to our request for new ones. She heard us out in that same machine-like, inhuman Lubyanka manner. And it was impossible to judge whether she had heard the authors' names or the titles, whether indeed she had heard our words at all. She would leave, and we would experience several hours of nervous but happy expectation. During those hours all the books we had returned were leafed through and checked. They were examined in case we had left pinpricks or dots underneath certain letters, for there was such a method of clandestine intramural communication, or we had underlined passages we liked with a fingernail. We were worried even though we were totally innocent. They might come to us and say that they had discovered pinpricks. They were always right, of course, and as always no proof was required, and on that basis we could be deprived of books for 3 months. If indeed they didn't put the whole cell on a punishment cell regime. It would be very sad to have to do without books during the best and brightest of our prison months, before we were tossed into the pit of camp. Indeed, we were not only afraid, we actually trembled, just as we had in youth after sending a love letter, while we waited for an answer. Will it come or not? And what will it say? Then at last the books arrived, and determined the pattern of the next 10 days. We would decide whether we would chiefly concentrate on reading, or if they had brought us trash, be spending more time in conversation. They brought exactly as many books as there were people in the cell, this being the sort of calculation appropriate to a bread cutter and not a librarian. 1 book for 1 person, 6 books for 6 persons. The cells with the largest number of prisoners were best off. Sometimes the spinster would fill our orders miraculously, but even when she was careless about them, things could turn out interestingly, because the library of the big Lubyanka was unique. In all probability it had been assembled out of confiscated private libraries. The bibliophiles who had collected those books had already rendered up their souls to God. But the main thing was that, while state security had been busy censoring and emasculating all the libraries of the nation for decades, it forgot to dig in its own bosom. Here, in its very den, one could read Zamyatin, Pilnyak, Pantelimon Romanov, and any volume at all of the complete works of Merezkovsky. Some people wisecracked that they allowed us to read forbidden books because they already regarded us as dead, but I myself think that the Lubyanka librarians hadn't the faintest concept of what they were giving us. They were simply lazy and ignorant. We used to read intensively during the hours before lunch, but it sometimes happened that a single phrase would get you going and drive you to pace from window to door and from door to window, and you would want to show somebody what you had read and explain what it implied, and then an argument would get started. It was a time for sharp arguments as well. I often argued with Yuri Y. On that March morning, when they had led the 5 of us into the Palladial cell 53, they had just added a 6th prisoner to our group. He entered, it seemed like a spirit, and his shoes made no noise against the floor. He entered, and, not sure that he could stay on his feet, leaned against the door-frame. The bulb had been turned off in the cell, and the morning light was dim. However, the newcomer did not have his eyes wide open. He squinted, and he kept silent. The cloth of his military field jacket and trousers did not identify him as coming from the Soviet or the German or the Polish or English army. The structure of his face was elongated. There was very little Russian in it, and he was painfully thin. And not only very thin, but very tall. We spoke to him in Russian, and he kept silent. Susie addressed him in German. He still kept silent. Festenko tried French and English, with the same result. Only gradually did a smile appear on his emaciated, yellow, half-dead face. The only such smile I had ever seen in my life. "People," he uttered weakly, as if he were coming out of a faint, or as if he had been waiting all night long to be executed, and he reached out his weak, emaciated hand. held a small bundle tied up in a rag. Our stoolie understood instantly what was in it, threw himself on it, grabbed it, and opened it up on the table. There was a half-pound of light tobacco. He had instantly managed to roll himself a cigarette 4 times the size of an ordinary one. Thus, after 3-week confinement in a cellar box, Yuri Nikolaevich made his appearance in our cell. From the time of the 1929 incidents of the Chinese Eastern Railroad, the song had been sung throughout the land. Its steel breast brushing aside our enemies, the 27th stands on guard. The chief of artillery of the 27th Infantry Division, formed back in the Civil War, was the Tsarist officer Nikolai Y. I remembered the name because it was the name of one of the authors of our artillery textbook. In a heated freight car that had been converted into living quarters, and always accompanied by his wife, this artillery officer had crossed and recrossed the Volga and the Urals, sometimes moving east and sometimes west. It was in this heated freight car that his son Yuri, born in 1917 and twin brother therefore of the revolution itself, spent his first years. That was a long time ago. Since then his father had settled in Leningrad in the academy, and lived well and frequented high circles, and the son graduated from the officer candidate school. During the Finnish War, Yuri wanted desperately to fight for the motherland, and friends of his father got him an appointment as an aide on an army staff. Yuri did not have to crawl on his stomach to destroy the Finns' concrete artillery emplacements, nor get trapped and encircled on a scouting mission, nor freeze in the snow under sniper bullets. But his service was nevertheless rewarded, not with some ordinary decoration, but with the Order of the Red Banner, which fitted neatly on his field shirt. Thus he completed the Finnish War in full consciousness of its justice and his own part in it. But he didn't have things so easy in the next war. The battery he commanded was surrounded near Luga. They scattered and were caught and driven off into prisoner-of-war camps. Yuri found himself in a concentration camp for officers near Vilnius. In every life there is one particular event that is decisive for the entire person, for his fate, his convictions, his passions. 2 years in that camp shook Yuri up once and for all. It was impossible to catch with words or to circumvent with syllogisms what that camp was. That was a camp to die in, and whoever did not die was compelled to reach certain conclusions. Among those who could survive were the ordiners, the internal camp police or polizei, chosen from among the prisoners. Of course, Yuri did not become an ordiner. The cook managed to survive too. The translators could survive also. They needed them. But though Yuri had a superb command of conversational German, he concealed this fact. He realized that a translator would have to betray his fellow prisoners. One could also postpone dying by digging graves, but others stronger and more dexterous got those jobs. Yuri announced that he was an artist, and actually as part of his varied education at home, he had been given lessons in painting. Yuri didn't paint badly in oils, and only his desire to follow in his father's footsteps, for he had been proud of his father, had kept him from entering art school. Together with an elderly artist, I regret that I don't remember his name, he occupied a separate room in the barracks, and there Yuri painted for nothing schmaltzy pictures such as Nero's Feast and the Chorus of Elves, and the like for the German officers and the commandant's staff. In return he was given food, the slops for which the POW officers stood in line with their mess tins from 6 a.m. on, while the ordiners beat them with sticks and the cooks with ladles, were not enough to sustain life. At evening, Yuri could see the windows of their room, the one and only picture for which his artistic talent had been given him. The evening mist hovering above a swampy meadow encircled by barbed wire, a multitude of bonfires, and around the bonfires, beings who had once been Russian officers but now became beast-like creatures who gnawed the bones of dead horses, who baked patties with potato rinds, who smoked manure and were all swarming with lice. Not all those two-legged creatures had died as yet. Not all of them had yet lost the capacity for an intelligible speech. And one could see in the crimson reflections of the bonfires how a belated understanding was dawning on those faces which were descending to the Neanderthal. Wormwood on the tongue. That life which Yuri had preserved was no longer precious to him for its own sake. He was not one of those who easily agree to forget. No, if he was going to survive, he was obliged to draw certain conclusions. It was already clear to them that the Germans were not the heart of the matter, or at least not the Germans alone, that among the POWs of many nationalities only the Soviets lived like this and died like this. None were worse off than the Soviets. Even the Poles, even the Yugoslavs, existed in far more tolerable conditions. And as for the English and the Norwegians, they were inundated by the International Red Cross with parcels from home. They didn't even bother to line up for the German rations. Wherever there were Allied POW camps next door, their prisoners, out of kindness, threw our men handouts over the fence, and our prisoners jumped on these gifts like a pack of dogs on a bone. The Russians were carrying the whole war on their shoulders, and this was the Russian lot. Why? Gradually, explanations came in from here and there. It turned out that the USSR did not recognize as binding Russia's signature to the Hague Convention on war prisoners. That meant that the USSR accepted no obligations at all in the treatment of war prisoners and took no steps for the protection of its own soldiers who had been captured. The USSR did not recognize the International Red Cross. The USSR did not recognize its own soldiers the day before. It did not intend to give them any help as POWs. And the heart of Yuri, enthusiastic twin of the October Revolution, grew cold. In their barracks room, he and the elderly artist clashed and argued. It was difficult for Yuri to accept. Yuri resisted, but the old man kept peeling off layer after layer. What was it all about? Stalin? But wasn't it too much to ascribe everything to Stalin, to those stubby hands? He who draws a conclusion only halfway fails to draw it at all. What about the rest of them? The ones right next to Stalin and below him, and everywhere around the country, all those whom the motherland had authorized to speak for it. What is the right course of action if our mother has sold us to the gypsies? No, even worse, thrown us to the dogs. Or does she really remain our mother? If a wife has become a whore, are we really still bound to her infidelity? A motherland that betrays its soldiers, is that really a motherland? And everything turned topsy-turvy for Yuri. He used to take pride in his father, now he cursed him. For the first time he began to consider that his father had, in essence, betrayed his oath to that army in which he had been brought up, had betrayed it in order to help establish the system which now betrayed its own soldiers. Why then was Yuri bound by his own oath to that traitorous system? When in the spring of 1943, recruiters from the 1st Byelorussian legions put in an appearance, some POWs signed up with them to escape starvation. Yuri went with them out of conviction and with a clear mind. But he didn't stay in the legion for long. As the saying goes, once they've skinned you, there's no point in grieving over the wool. By this time, Yuri had given up hiding his excellent knowledge of German, and soon a certain chief, a German from near Kassel, who had been assigned to create an espionage school with an accelerated wartime output, took Yuri as his right-hand man. And that was how Yuri began the downward slide he had not foreseen. That was how things got turned around. Yuri passionately desired to free his motherland. And what did they do but shove him into training spies? The Germans had their own plans. Just where could one draw the line? Which step was the fatal one? Yuri became a lieutenant in the German army. He traveled through Germany in German uniform, spent some time in Berlin, visited Russian émigrés, and read authors like Bunin, Nabokov, Aldanov, Amphitryov, whose works were forbidden at home. Yuri had anticipated that in all their writing, in Bunin's, for example, the blood flowing from Russia's living wounds would pour from every page. What was wrong with them? To what did they devote their unutterably precious freedom? To the female body, to ecstasy, sunsets, the beauty of noble brows, to anecdotes going back to dusty years. They wrote as if there had been no revolution in Russia, as if it were too complex for them to explain. They left it to young Russian people to find for themselves what was highest in life, and Yuri dashed back and forth in a hurry to see, in a hurry to know. And meanwhile, in accordance with ancient Russian tradition, he kept drowning his confusion more and more often and more deeply in vodka. What was their spy school really? It was, of course, not a real one. All they could be taught in 6 months was to master the parachute, the use of explosives, and the use of portable radios. The Germans put no special trust in them. In sending them across the lines, they were simply whistling in the dark. And for those dying, hopelessly abandoned Russian POWs, those schools, in Yuri's opinion, were a good way out. The men ate their fill, got new warm clothing, and in addition had their pockets stuffed with Soviet money. The students and their teachers acted as as if all this nonsense were genuine, as if they would actually carry out spying missions in the Soviet rear, blow up the designated objectives, get back in touch with the Germans via radio, and return to the German lines. But in reality, in their eyes, the school was simply a means of sidestepping death and captivity. They wanted to live, but not at the price of shooting their own compatriots at the front. The Germans sent them across the front lines, and from then on their free choice depended on their own morality and conscience. They all threw away their TNT and radio apparatus immediately. The only point on which they differed was whether to surrender to the authorities immediately, like the snub-nosed Chappie I had encountered at Army Counterintelligence Headquarters, or whether they got drunk first and have some fun squandering all that free money. None of them ever recrossed the front lines to the Germans. Suddenly, as the new year of 1945 approached, one smart fellow did return and reported he had carried out his assignment. Just go and check on it. He created a sensation. The chief hadn't the slightest doubt that Smersh had sent him back and decided to shoot him. The fate of a conscientious spy. But Yuri insisted that he be given a decoration instead, and held up as an example to the others taking the course. The returned spy invited Yuri to drink a quart of vodka with them, and Crimson from drink leaned across the table and disclosed, Yuri Nikolaevich. The Soviet command promises you forgiveness if you will come over to us immediately. Have a good day, friends.